Minimalists.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Minimalist Podcast, where we discuss what it means to live a meaningful life with less. My name is Joshua Fields Milburn.
And I am Ryan Nicodemus, and together we are the Minimalists.
Welcome to episode 133. Today we're going to talk about constraints. Now, I was talking to Bex.
Is that why you brought all these handcuffs?
I was talking to Bex this weekend. She said the same thing. She's like, are you talking like handcuffs? Like, I'm like, no, that's restraints.
Our recommendation on constraints?
No, those are restraints. So maybe we'll do an episode on restraints in the future. But right now we're going to talk about constraints. And while we're here, before we dive into these questions, Ryan, let's talk about some useful constraints in our life, some things that really came to mind right away as I started preparing for this episode. Our last documentary was certainly constrained, but it bred a particular kind of creativity. We didn't have a $1 million budget, or I guess movies now have $100 million budgets. We had a $0 budget during the filming.
I don't know if it would have been any better if we had a $100 million budget.
And one could argue it would be worse. I mean, if you go back, David Foster Wallace wrote a great essay about Terminator 2 and how it basically couldn't hold a candle to Terminator 1. And he gave a really good argument why it didn't. But essentially what it came down to is James Cameron is a genius, and he was constrained with that first one. He didn't have a huge budget. So he had to do certain things with lighting and atmospherics that a person with a gigantic budget to do special effects, all this other stuff, wouldn't have to do. So he made this ominous, dark movie. Part of that was almost by accident, or because of, not by accident, but because of the constraints. He worked with what he had, and those constraints made the film better. And I think about our documentary when it was like, okay, we're already on the road, so we're not going to pay for all this travel. So in 2014, when we filmed this, it was like, okay, what cities are we going to? And who in those cities can we interview? Because we can't afford to fly to Egypt to interview someone. Right. We can't afford to fly to Wichita to interview someone. So what are the cities we're going to be in? Let's find the appropriate people to talk to while we are there. And we just happened to find 25, 30 people, and half of which made it into the documentary. And what I realized is, like, the only money we spent on that film, the only costs for the film were post-production. The filming itself didn't really cost us anything because we brought Matt on the road with us, and he already had the camera equipment that was necessary for the filming. And so you're right, man. Had we had $1 million or $10 million, well, it's funny, what would we do with it?
I don't know. Even if we flew to Egypt, I don't even know someone in Egypt we would have interviewed.
Now, here's the thing. We may have stumbled across someone. And so
the only thing I think we could have done better with the documentary, even though it's an outstanding documentary, we could have just dove a little bit deeper into some of the environmental stuff with fast fashion. We could have maybe dove a little bit deeper into like the architecture and certain pieces of the documentary that, if we had the budget for, we could have, flown out and got those bits of those extra bits that might dive a little bit deeper. But two things: A, the documentary is awesome. Like, I'm really proud of it.
Yes.
So I'm not like sitting here saying, "Oh, I wish we did more." I'm saying, could we have done more? Sure. There's always going to be something we could do better with a creation that we made, right?
Right.
The second thing too is that we can still dive deeper. Yes. We didn't have to do it in that last documentary, and we are totally planning to dive a little bit deeper with some stuff that we have planned in the future.
Right.
So even though maybe we don't have that for that last documentary, it's still okay.
Yeah, well, I think you can never create this infinitely dense thing where it's like, I want to include everything that I've ever known and everything I could possibly talk about, and also have rebuttals to every potential argument that all critics are going to have. And by the way, it has to fit inside this nice, neat 79-minute narrative. That's simply not possible. And so you realize, and that's another constraint. Having just an hour and a half is a particular kind of constraint. There's a reason that TED Talks are 18 minutes or less, is because you constrain yourself to that time frame. You can't talk about everything. You have to get into the point. It allows you to dive deep enough into the point that hopefully someone wants more, and they do their own research.
Kind of forces you to dive deep.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, or if you have someone like Derek Sivers, who we had on the podcast recently, he has 3 TED Talks, all of which I believe are 3 minutes each.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the ultimate constraint, where he knows I can't talk about 99.99999% of everything I'd like to talk about. So what is the one idea I want people to walk away from this talk or this podcast or this book or this blog post with? By the way, the documentary we're talking about, for those of you who are new for some reason, It's just called Minimalism, and you can find it on Netflix or wherever you find documentaries. If you haven't seen our documentary yet, and I think the same is true with books. I mean, we didn't have any budget for writing books. You and I, when we wrote our second book, my favorite book, the thing that we created, Everything That Remains, we moved to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. You talk about constraints, like all you have is time to write, pretty much, right? The nearby town is population 870 or 820, and there's one traffic light and 3,400 square miles, so maybe you go grocery shopping once a week or every other week sometimes. Otherwise, you have this constraint of these four walls and your creativity. And so quite often the constraints that we often get pissed off about, why don't I have more money, more time, more whatever? Why don't I have more? Because sometimes that more isn't going to serve you. In fact, sometimes that more is going to get in the way of what you're trying to do, especially if you're trying to create something or do something that is meaningful. Sometimes those constraints can guide you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's funny how I think about a life with no constraints. And when I imagine people who I've ran into throughout my almost 37 years of existence, the people with no constraints are sometimes like the least happiest.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is. Maybe because when you have no constraints, you expect things to be really easy. And life is not easy. It never will be easy.
Well, you say going with the flow, and that sounds great for a while until you end up at some rapids without a paddle and without a plan. And then that's when you're in for a world of hurt. I mean, I think of children, they need to be constrained. Otherwise, they run wild. We were watching that video this weekend. I want to go do hood rat stuff with my friends. Like the little 7-year-old kid driving his grandma's car and crashing into a bunch of stuff. That's kind of what we do, but sort of just in a more adult way, or at least ostensibly adult way.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were saying that, I was just thinking about it, an unconstrained child. I mean, what does an unconstrained child look like? Yes, he's driving around his grandma's car at 7 years old with his friend doing hood rat things. That's right. I'm quoting him, by the way.
Yeah, that's... the news anchor said, "Don't you realize you could have killed some people?" And he said, "Yeah, but I wanted to do hood rat stuff with my friends." and that's sort of what we're doing right now. We're wasting our time. In fact, I'm going to do this right now. When we travel, I put email and Instagram and Twitter back on my phone while we're traveling, so I don't always have to carry my computer with me. And but when we're not traveling, which we're back. We were just in Joshua Tree this weekend working on the second documentary, which is full of all kinds of constraints. Although we have fewer constraints now, although we're sort of self-imposing some constraints. So we have some opportunities to, instead of just going the route we went before, where we like to do stuff ourselves, to partner up with a major studio and do something like that. In fact, we've had several people try to talk us into going that route, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but for us, we wanted the constraint of, let's do this ourselves so that we won't have other people telling us what to do with that product.
Well, it's interesting. When we were in Joshua Tree, Matt, he was talking about, oh man, maybe we could do this one scene. We would have to have a bigger budget for it. And when we were talking about it, it was like, oh wow, like putting this one scene, renting out the space and getting the location ready for us to film could possibly double our budget.
Yeah.
And
for a 2-minute scene.
For a 2-minute scene. And the question is, would that scene really add that much value to the documentary? Maybe, maybe not.
Right.
But I mean, all three of us kind of looked at each other like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of silly.
Yes.
We got to stick to the basics here.
Right.
Stick to what we know. And throwing, more money at this documentary isn't necessarily what's going to make it better.
Right. And so the second documentary is called The Minimalists, Less Is Now, and it's around this talk. Ryan and I gave this talk 50 times in the last year. We did a 50-city tour, and we sort of refined the talk on different stages. And so we went and filmed that talk, and it's 40 minutes plus. That was what we got it down to. And then we're building the next documentary around that talk. And that in and of itself is sort of a constraint, because you're constrained to what is already there. Like, what's the format of this thing? But then also, how do we expand beyond it? Because we don't want it to just be a 40-minute talk. Like, that would be fine. That'd be one thing. But this is also, it's a half documentary, half special. So you're sort of within the constraints of a format, or maybe sometimes you break outside of the restraints of the format, and you go 10% farther to create your own thing. And that's where originality and the uniqueness comes from, is you use those constraints to your advantage, and sometimes you're like, well, I need to break free of that. Now, that scene you're talking about, recording a 2-minute scene and doubling the budget of the film, would that be worth it? Probably not. But then the question becomes, given the constraints we have, if we can't afford to spend $30,000 on a 2-minute scene, then what do we do? Can we still do it and make it meaningful? And then maybe, just maybe, it becomes more meaningful because we have the constraints we have to work within these constraints, and so we have to get more creative in order for it to work.
Yeah.
Because sometimes what happens is people just throw money at the problem. And money won't solve your problems. It'll solve your money problems, but it's not going to solve your creativity problems. It's not going to solve your relationship problems. I know that the number one thing that couples fight about is sex, and then money is second, right? Well, it's not going to solve your sex problems. It's not even going to solve your relationship problems that are masked as money problems, right? Because guess what? There are plenty of people who are millionaires who still have fights about money. In fact, there are probably more people on average, as a percentage, that have fights about money because they have excess, right?
Yeah.
And everyone wants a piece of their money. Oh, so anyway, what I'm going to do right now is add a constraint to myself. I'm going to my phone and deleting Instagram and my email and Twitter real quick.
How do you delete your email?
What?
Can you delete your email on your phone?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just by holding it down?
Yes. Just hold it down until it submits, Ryan.
Oh, my God.
Restrain that email.
My mind has just been blown. I am.
So I just deleted my Twitter and my Instagram. I still interact on these platforms, don't get me wrong. I just don't like having them on my phone. Now, Ryan, let's talk about why I don't like having those on my phone, because for me, they become an easy out. They become an easy go-to. They become a pacifier for me, and they actually get in the way. They prevent me from creating, because when there's a time where I'm like, oh, I should be writing this morning. Oh, I will. Let me just check Instagram real quick. I'll just pull out my phone and start checking. No. For me, in order for me to have good habits in my life, I often have to have my self-imposed constraints. I don't want other people necessarily putting the constraints on my life. That's sort of totalitarian. I'm not into that. But what I'm into is defining the limitations that work best for me. And quite often, I know if I'm grasping for something, if I'm twitching for something is a better word. If I'm twitching for it, maybe I should remove it from my life for a period of time. In fact, once I have Twitter off my phone, I actually enjoy it a lot more, because now when I go to it with intention. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to spend half an hour replying to tweets and looking at other people's tweets and checking some articles, and it's with intention. It's not just the constant scrolling. The essay, the scrolling is the new smoking that we put out on the website. That's really the place where I've gotten with a lot of my technology, is I've treated it like it's an impulse, right?
Yeah.
So
it's easy to do.
I've removed that. Before we get into these questions, I also wanted to talk to you about this cute little cartoon I have.
I was wondering what that cartoon was over there. I was going to ask you, but I was like, oh, maybe it's for the added value portion. I won't ruin it. So
no, in the mornings I generally like to write, exercise, and read, but I've moved a lot of my reading to nighttime now. That way I can just do two things in the morning. I'm exercising and I'm writing. But when I'm reading, sometimes I read the New Yorker, because they have some good fiction in there, but also some other good journalism. And this was just one of those cartoons from the New Yorker, and it's a lady at a birthday party, and she's got this big smile on her face, and she's saying, "Thank you so much." And there's presents all over the table, birthday presents, right? And she says, "Thank you so much. I'll keep this in my special box of things I can't throw away for fear of hurting someone's feelings." Now, obviously, this episode has nothing to do with gift giving, but to me, this was the we get this question all the time, a form of this question or this statement where it's like, I'm holding on to something because I'm afraid of hurting other people's feelings.
Well, it could go along with our podcast because, dude, this is an example of how this person, and I used to be one of those people who would not constrain myself on getting gifts.
Yes.
I had no constraints. So then I had a bunch of shit I didn't use.
Right.
to not offend people who gave me the gifts, but ultimately I realized, like, when you're honest with people, they really don't care they're your gifts. You can do what you want with them.
Exactly. And in a weird way, you're almost offending yourself, or you're offending your sensibilities.
Dude, if I gave you something and like you took it and you were like, "Oh, thank you so much," but then like you went home and you went to Bex and you're like, "Man, I really do appreciate Ryan giving me this." I'm holding a
coaster. Let's call it a
coaster. I mean, I really appreciate
diamond encrusted coaster.
I really appreciate Ryan giving me this diamond encrusted coaster, but I really am not going to use this thing. It's the only coaster I own. I'm certainly not going to just set it on my table to, like, if it was causing you all this stress,
right,
I would feel like a jerk if you held on to it.
Right. Well, and that's because you're healthy with respect to understanding other people's needs. There are some people who will truly get their feelings hurt, and here's the thing: you can't control someone else's feelings. You can't control how someone else is going to react. So I mean, I think this response would be hilarious. In fact, I might start using this if someone gives me a gift. I might say, "Oh, I'll keep this in my special box of things I can't throw away because I'm afraid of hurting other people's feelings."
You're not a jerk like that.
No, well, but you just said, like, if someone isn't being considerate, maybe I'm not the one being the jerk. If someone's giving me something I've repeatedly asked them not to give me, who's the person who's being the jerk?
The person who's escalating the situation.
That's also true. But maybe the way to de-escalate something.
I understand what you're saying.
Kafka said that the only way to deal with life's most serious challenges is through jokes. And maybe if you have the right person, you can. I mean, I could say this to you, and it would be hilarious.
It would be funny.
Yeah, and so
my mama always told me too that. Just because it's a joke doesn't mean it doesn't hurt someone's feelings.
Right. and just because it's a joke also doesn't mean it's funny.
Right.
But if you do want to hear more about gift giving, we've done a couple episodes about this. We did one called Easter, although, and it was just recently. It was episode 125. Although it wasn't just about Easter. There was only one question in there about Easter. But we talked about gift giving and excess during the holidays, right? And another one we did was called gift giving, episode 38. So episode 125 is Easter and episode 38 is gift giving. If you want some tips and tricks and advice for gift giving, we answer some questions on both of those episodes. You can find those over at, wherever you get podcasts, really. All right, let's dive into these questions. Cool with you?
Let's do it.
All right, first question is from Cheryl in Dallas.
I'm 62. I'm from a small Texas town, now living in a major market city, and work in advertising and marketing. After ending a 30-year marriage and leaving a 4,500 square foot house, I began to live on my own. I've moved about 6 or 7 times in the last 10 years. With each move, I've gotten rid of more and more stuff. About a year ago, I sold my house and gave away almost everything I had to a nonprofit that helps women who had to leave their homes suddenly due to domestic violence, and they have nothing to recreate a home for themselves and their children. Furniture, dishes, linens, decor, everything, except my grown son's stuff from their childhood. I'm now living in a 1-bedroom apartment with new and minimal furniture, dishes, etc., and I kind of like it. My question is, coming from a mindset of having plenty of room for the kids and the grandkids to come home, things for the children to inherit, plus being a woman and having jewelry and makeup and lots of shoes and all that other fun stuff, do you have advice for someone like me? Do you have stories of people of my generation and mindset as they have minimized? I'd like to have a tiny house, but those seem to be for people who don't have a lot of clothes or business clothes or makeup, and they have the athletic ability to make trips up and down a loft ladder several times a night. I'm thinking 1,000 square feet is about as tiny as I could get by with.
Well, Cheryl, first of all, I think this, and Ryan, you tell me what you think about this, but I think this proves that the things that used to add value to Cheryl's life, she was in this 4,500 square foot house in a former life, a former season of her life with her former spouse. Those things may have added value. She may have gotten joy from them. but she walked away from them, but someone else is actually getting value from them. Now she's found a way, instead of storing them or hoarding them or putting them in the basement or trying to refill. I mean, I think consumerism is a noxious gas of sorts. Like, it finds a way to fill whatever space you have created for it, right? And so if you have a 4,500 square foot house, it's all this stuff that's been going on with Kanye West recently. You know what I'm talking about. I mean, all the things.
Sure.
So I saw the interview. The most impressive thing for me is that he has this giant house and he doesn't feel compelled to fill it with a bunch of stuff. It looks empty. Because I think that's the thing that might calm some of his whatever's going on in his mind. It's a way for him to calm the mind. I know it certainly is for me, a way to calm my mind, regardless of what you think of Kanye West and many of the rants he's been going on now. That thing was like, it's a little throwaway thought, but I just looked at it. I'm like, oh, like he has a massive house, but most people, they get 4,500 square foot house, 10,000 square foot house. I must fill every nook and cranny, right? Because I'm constrained only by the walls in my house.
Yeah, I've had mentoring students who they're like, I've got this big house and I've got this big empty basement, and I've got some things down there very similar to what Cheryl was describing, with memories and with inheritance stuff and so forth and so on. And they're like, is it okay that I have this stuff stored? And like, first off, I always say, like, yeah, you can do whatever you want. You're an adult. It's okay to do whatever you want, as long as it's not, imposing on other people's rights.
Right.
But yes, yeah. First and foremost, yes, you do have permission. But second off, let me ask you: if you didn't have that basement, would you be holding on to all that stuff? Oh no, I probably wouldn't be holding on to nearly as much of it.
Yeah, would you go rent a storage locker and pay for the additional space, right? And the line from Cheryl's message that stood out the most to me, Ryan, was her voice turned up. I could hear her smile when she's talking about she lives in the 1-bedroom house now, and she goes, I kind of like it.
Yeah.
And that to me says it all, right? She's like, I've downsized. I've let go. I've moved 6 or 7 times. I've gotten rid of almost everything, all the excess. I've set down the baggage that I once picked up, right? And she says, and you know what? I kind of like it. But now I'm looking at, how do I go even farther? How do I have more of less? and I don't see I could ever live in a tiny house. Well, you know what? You probably could. But the question isn't, can you live in a tiny house? You can live on the street. You can go camping for the rest of your life. You can do a lot of things. The question, I think, is what is appropriate for your life right now? And maybe at 62, now that you're in a big city in Dallas, and 1,000 square feet is appropriate for you. I know me and my family, we live in about 900 square feet, but it's a really nice place. It has everything we need. We have a bedroom, and Ella has a bedroom. We have a living room. We have a small kitchen. We have a bathroom. Everything is fine for us. It works really well for us. But what's appropriate for me may not be appropriate for you. And so the question then becomes, what are the constraints that you can impose in your life? Where are the edges for you right now? And maybe it's just putting constraints closer to those edges so you can figure out what is truly adding value to your life and maybe what you can let go of.
She talks a little bit about being a woman and having makeup and clothes and shoes and stuff like that. This is anecdotal evidence from Mariah. Obviously, I don't have a bunch of shoes and makeup and stuff, but what I'll say is, over the 5 years that Mariah and I have been together, she has gone out of her way to have the best curated collection that she can of the things that she mentioned there: clothes, shoes, makeup. So that Mariah, when she goes to her closet, when she goes to her makeup drawer, when she goes to pull out a pair of shoes, like, she knows that she's going to grab something that she's absolutely in love with. So these are constraints that I certainly have never, I've said this a million times, I'll say it a million times again, I've never asked Mariah to throw any constraints on herself. But what she has realized is that when she does put constraints on herself, specifically with these items, it's much easier to make decisions when she's getting ready to go out, when she's getting ready in the mornings. But the other thing Cheryl asked for too was stories about people maybe her age who were going through the same thing. And dude, it made me think about, I forget what city we were in, but there was this older couple, elderly couple, who I'm sorry. Oh my God. I'm telling the end of the story first. There was a younger couple who they were talking about how they were very worried about when their parents passed away, The gentleman's father was close to passing away. The woman's mother or father, they were close to passing away, and they felt all of this anxiety from this horde of stuff that they knew was coming down the line as soon as those people passed away. And, we kind of gave our advice and, told them to have a conversation with the parents and talked about, when someone dies and they leave you all their stuff, it's yours now and they're passed away. So you can do anything you want with that. And, we gave them some good ideas. I'm not going to sit here and unpack that whole answer we gave them. But what really impressed me about that event is when, after that question was over, there was the elderly couple who was like, oh my God, like we were here to talk to these guys about how we could let go of all this hordes of things that we're holding on to for our grandkids, the extra space that we have when they come over and all of these things, and watching this younger couple almost like it represented to them their kids, and it gave them this huge revelation of like, oh wow, like seeing that younger couple air their grief to us about this horde of stuff that they're about to get, it helped them see what they were doing to their own children. Yeah. And I think that a lot of people in Cheryl's situation who are 65 years old and they've got all these things that they want to pass on down to their kids, all these trinkets and watches and whatever else, people pass down, they really need to consider how their kids feel about it. Right. So, I mean, for people in Cheryl's situation, if you're 65 years old and you don't know what to do with this stuff, ask your kids. Now, here's the thing, though. If you ask your kids, do you want me to hang on to this? They're probably just going to say yes. Hey, do you want me to hang on to this old yearbook? Sure. Do you want me to hang on to this? Sure. Try giving this stuff away now. Yeah,
absolutely. Because the thing is, if I'm, I might say yes, I want to store it in your basement, because maybe I want it someday. The moral of the story there is no one wants your excess.
No, because they might say, yes, I want you to store it. But if you say, no, okay, if you want that, I'm going to ask you to come and get it now. Let's not wait until I die. Yeah. Take this stuff now. The question is are they willing to store it? Yes. Are they willing to take up some of their physical space to store the item? Because if they're not, they probably don't want that item that bad. Now, there's always exceptions to the rules, right? Of course. But by and large, I would encourage people to take that approach who are facing the same situation as Cheryl.
Now, Cheryl's also having a difficulty because her space isn't big enough for having a bunch of guests over now. You can't have 17 kids and grandkids and all this other stuff. Here's what I'll say to that is you can't plan for everything, Cheryl. That's why hotels and Airbnb exist. You have friends who are coming into town. They can stay at the Airbnb right up the street because it's not going to happen that much. You don't need to have an abundance of excess space so you can use it 3 times a year.
What you could do is sell all of that stuff, downsize, and then when people come into town, you'll have enough money to pay for the Airbnb that they're going to be in for a few nights.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine if you, Ryan, you have a 2-bedroom place now. Imagine if you're like, well, I'm going to get a 3-bedroom place and I'm going to spend however much extra it's going to cost, $500 a month every month for the next 12 months. I'm going to spend $6,000 extra dollars just in case someone wants to come over sometime. Imagine what you could do with that $6,000. Maybe 500 of it is going to go toward people coming to town. Maybe 1,000. You just saved $5,000. You don't need all the excess space. And by the way, sometimes you can just make it work. We've got some family coming in June, and we don't have enough space for them. So Ella is going to sleep out on the couch for a couple days, and then Bex's sister and her husband are going to be in Ella's room, and everything's going to be just fine for a few days. Now, if it's longer than a few days, then guess what? You got to find a hotel. But we can make it work for a couple days, and Ella thinks it's an adventure anyway.
Yeah, man. I was just gonna say I just want to reiterate what I was saying with Cheryl's situation, and to any parents or grandparents out there who are holding on to a hoard load of heirlooms for their kids, or they're having extra space. Don't assume what your kids want. Like, talk to your kids about what they want. Because if you assume what your kids want, then you're going to hold on to everything.
Absolutely. And guess what? They're going to be honest with you, especially when confronted with now. Because people don't want to. They're willing to. We're all us people. We are willing to put off today's decisions to tomorrow. But if you're forced to confront it today, that's a type of constraint. Hey, I have this extra excess stuff, and we need to deal with it today. Now, a couple options for you here. One is I'm going to get it out of my house today. So option one is you can take it. Option two is I'm going to donate it to one of these three places where someone else can get value from it, right? Yep. Or option three, help me figure out where else it should go, but it's got to leave my house today. That's the constraint, or this week or this month or whatever that constraint may be. Last thing for Cheryl, ask yourself a question. What do you want to fill your life with now? I know you're talking about downsizing and minimizing, getting rid of all the stuff, and I think that's great. The question now is, what are you filling your life with? I think that aching feeling that you might be feeling right now of, but what about when people want to come to town? Or what about the makeup and the jewelry and the da-da-da-da-da? Those are just things. What experiences are you going to fill your life with now? What are your values? So I'd love to send you a copy of our book, Minimalism, Live a Meaningful Life. It's our first book, and Ryan and I wrote about once we got rid of the stuff, what do we fill our life with? We identify what were the 5 foundational values for us in that book, and then how we reshaped our life, refocused our life around those values, how we started bringing everything that we did, matched all of our daily activities and actions and priorities around those 5 values. So, Sean, if you could reach out to Cheryl, send her an audiobook version of that. If you like our podcast, you'll really like the audiobook. It's our shortest book. But also, you know what? It's available in print and ebook as well. So if Cheryl would prefer one of those, please send her one of those instead. Our next question is from Derek in Indiana.
I own an appliance repair business based out of Crown Point. I can pretty much take my business anywhere I want. The main thing that's holding me back from moving to a better climate and traveling the world like I want and being a minimalist like I really want to be, I have wanted to be for quite some time now, is the fact that I have split custody of my daughter and her mother lives here by where I live. Tried brainstorming, I come up with nothing every time. And the other question was basically, minimizing on the things and minimizing on the size of a home and all that, like doing something along the lines of the tiny homes. I just want to know how people do that with a kid when your kid likes having sleepovers and kids like running around. And then, of course, winter being a major factor with them not being able to run around outside. It's cold as hell up here in Northwest Indiana. It's a lot of factors that seem to be working against minimalism and seeing the world. The split custody thing, like I said, is the major thing. Not being able to move abroad and pursue my dreams of just, kind of backpacking it. I got at least 7 years before she's 18 and I can do that. So that's the big obstacle there. And if you could help me out here and give me some brainstorming ideas, that'd be awesome. I appreciate it. Oh, and the last thing is I have a lease that I have until August. And that's another thing holding me back. So I'd have to pay $1,200 a month to that. Okay. Thank you.
So it seems to me that Derek is constrained by geography.
He has temporary constraints right now.
Exactly.
Yeah, he has constraints that are imposed on him that he has no control over. So the question that Derek is asking is, I have these constraints. Uh-huh. I have no choice of these constraints. How can I do what I want to do given these constraints? Yeah. And I'll tell you, man, the one thing that I made the biggest mistake of was always telling myself that my constraints prevented me from taking even one step towards what I wanted to do.
Yes.
Now, in Derek's question here, he talks about how he wants to travel more. He wants to get out of Indiana and live that peripatetic. He wants to be Colin Wright. He wants to be that type of minimalist, and that's awesome. Maybe he's not able to move to a new country every 4 months like Colin had, but right now, what he can absolutely do is he can still take a few steps towards that vagabond lifestyle that he wants to live. It could be including his daughter. It could, I don't know how, I'm just throwing this out there because like you and Carrie get along really well, you and your ex-wife. I don't know how well him and his ex-wife get along, but let's say he wants to go somewhere for a month or 2 months. So he waits for summer vacation and he wants to plan a trip for him and his daughter. And the mother is like, "Oh no, you can't pull my daughter away for 2 months. That's crazy. I'm not going to be away from her." Well, maybe you can invite her to come along, and maybe that's a really stupid idea. And Derek here is like laughing right now, hearing this, like, "Ha ha, she would never come on that." But I'm just saying, thinking along those lines, trying to find a substitute for what he wants to do. It's just not a complete loss here for Derek.
Yeah, and also I'm going to push back on Derek's idea of constraints here, that because he said something that really stuck out to me, that I've been brainstorming, I came up with nothing, and the problem with that is quite often people will say I've tried everything and I still can't get past my constraints. But if I say, "Oh, you've tried everything?" Well, yeah, man, everything. Okay, name everything. No, tell you what, just name 1,000 things that you've tried.
Right.
Well, no, I haven't tried 1,000 things. That's crazy. Okay, well, 10% that. Try. What are the 100 things you've tried? I haven't tried 100 things to get away from my constraints. So you've tried how many? Well, I've tried the same 3 things over and over, and they haven't worked for me. That's the definition of insanity right there, right? And so the thing that I recognize is that if you're going to live an unconventional life, which you are, which is what you want, Derek, that if you want it enough, you'll find a way to make it happen, right? I can think of 2 examples right off the top. Number 1 is me. When I first met Bex, I was moving to Los Angeles. The month that I met Rebecca, I was getting ready to sign a lease. And then I met her, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I really like this girl. I want to see what's going to happen. So how about I give it a year or 2 in Montana? Although I was done with Montana. I did not want to be there anymore. It was great for that season, but I was no longer happy with that current constraint. But I'm like, let's try it out, see what happens. Well, when I met Beck, she had a 1-year-old, Ella, a brand new kid, right? And when we met, I realized, like, well, okay, and her former spouse weren't on the best of terms. They weren't on the worst of terms either, but they certainly weren't on the best of terms. And so I realized, like, oh, well, moving to LA is going to be impossible. I'm brainstorming, and I can't think of a single way I can make this happen. But that's silly, right? Like, if you want something bad enough, you'll figure out a way to make it work.
I didn't even realize, like, you literally had the same situation.
Yeah,
I mean,
same exact situation.
Pretty much. I mean, it wasn't.
Although my constraint was 17 years instead of 7. His daughter's 11. Ella was 1 at the time. Right. And I'm like, you know what? I know I'm not going to stay in Montana for the next 17 years, so I have an option of staying here and being not happy about that, or how do I make it as ecstatic, joyous, pleasurable, meaningful as possible the time I'm going to be here, but also like so that's what you just said. Like, okay, you've got 7 years, maybe it's less than 7 years. You can take steps toward where you want to go in the meantime. But during those 7 years, what does your ideal life look like while you're there? Not perfect life.
Yeah. What does a step towards your perfect life look like?
Exactly.
What does 2 steps towards your perfect life look like?
Well, not even perfect. So for me, it's like,
or ideal life, whatever you want to.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's not let perfect get in the way of Derek, because I think that's what's happening with Derek right now. He's like, a perfect life for me would be traveling the world and da. Yeah, you know what?
I just want to be clear. No one's life is ever going to be perfect.
Exactly. And so let's not aspire toward that. Let's aspire toward what's ideal for Derek over the next 7 years. And then you start taking steps toward what is ideal. And for me, it was those last 2 years we were in Montana after being with Bex. It was over 2 years. And about 2.5 years, I realized, like, okay, like, I can work toward getting to LA. Now, I've brainstormed. I can't think of anything. Let's figure this out together. I've got a great support group. I've got great friends, people who are supportive. How can I make this work? And we put all kinds of options on the table. No idea is a stupid idea. Let's put them all on the table, right? And what we worked out with is certainly not, what we ended up with is certainly not perfect. But we said, okay, for the next year, here's what we're going to try. I'm going to be in California nearly full time. Bex is going to be 50-50, Montana and California. Ella is going to come to California once a month. I'm going to make it back to Montana once a month. That's the template. Now, does it always work that way? No. Sometimes there are holidays and custody things or whatever it might be, but that's the template around which we've built our life for the next year. The next year part is important. That's not how it's going to be for infinity. It's just the next year, and then we continue to reassess. Is this still working for us? Is this the best scenario? Is this the most ideal scenario given the constraints that we have?
I think there's some way like we can use your situation to help Derek here. So the only difference that I see between your situation and Derek's situation is his kid is in school right now.
Right.
So
is mine.
Have you? Oh, she's in kindergarten now?
Well, she's in Montessori school, which is pre-kindergarten.
So when she starts attending public schools, attendance is required a little bit different than a Montessori school.
That's true.
So have you guys come up with any solutions on how to keep her in school and to kind of make this both locations work?
Absolutely. So for kindergarten, we found a school that is willing to be a bit flexible with her time.
Awesome.
Away. Yeah, and so
isn't that funny? That just that one point though, I never would have thought of that, man.
Yeah,
I never would have thought of trying to find a school that's going to be a little bit more flexible with allowing kids to have time off.
Yeah,
like just that as an option, I think would help Derek out. I'm sorry, continue.
Well, and it's been I've along the way, I have to be really appreciative of Bex because she's been willing to go out of her way to travel quite a bit. So we had to move to a smaller apartment in Montana that her and Ella are living at, pretty much full time, or Bex is there half the time, right? And in order to be able to make it work, so it was a smaller place. So it wasn't a tiny house. Now Derek mentioned moving to a tiny house. How do you do that with kids? I wouldn't personally do that with kids.
Mariah and I don't have kids, and we wouldn't move to a tiny house. I mean, that's just not what we want to do.
Exactly. But if it is what you want to do, you can do it.
Yeah, and
remember the family we ran into, Bex's friend in Australia, where we were in Sydney.
Sydney. What was the bay we went? The beach we went to?
Bondi.
Yeah, Bondi Beach or something. It was gorgeous.
We were trying to get on Bondi Rescue.
Josh just wanted to get mouth-to-mouth CPR from a sexy lifeguard.
Yeah. Well, sexy is a perspectival term. Anyway, yeah, I'm gonna stop there. But we met up with a great family, and there were 6 kids. 6 kids, 2 parents, and they were caravanning around all of Australia for the entire year, or 9 months, and they were at the end of that 8.5 months. And talk about a constraint. They're in a RV for 9 months.
Yeah, like I think an RV is almost like a tinier home.
Yeah,
tinier than a tiny home.
Right, it's a tiny home that moves. It's a tiny home with a steering wheel.
Yeah, with an engine and a steering wheel, right?
And so here's the thing. There were some of the most cultured and well-behaved children I'd ever seen. Now, clear that year had tested them, right? And I think any constraints are going to test you. But what do we get out of that testing? We get growth from when we're tested. We go through boot camp. It's a type of test. Someone in the military is going through boot camp, and it's like that's the ultimate sort of testing, right? When you do a Navy SEAL testing, that they go through what is so rigorous, but they become the people who make it out to the other side, and even the people who fail that come out the other side generally a better person from the experience. So is it possible? Heck yeah, it's possible. But here's the other thing. What's your ideal life look like for the next 7 years, Derek? But then what does your ideal life look like once your daughter turns 18? Maybe she comes with you for a year. Maybe she has a gap year and she gets to travel with you. And until then, you are because part of the fun of an experience is the anticipatory experience leading up to the physical experience itself, the actual travel, the immersion. The anticipation is often just as rewarding as the immersion. In fact, that's why they recommend planning vacations well in advance, so you get the joy of anticipation the entire time.
Absolutely. And Derek, when it comes to the tiny house, man, I mean, just look at what is appropriate for your life, for your daughter, and for your daughter's friends that she wants to bring over. I mean, Cheryl here, she's single, 65, 1,000 square foot is her, the question before, her perfect size of a house, she said, was 1,000 square foot. That's what she feels like is enough for her. That's awesome. Cheryl has been able to discover what the size of her house needs to be. Derek, yours doesn't have to be 1,000 square foot. It doesn't have to be 90 square foot. It does sound like what you have right now might be a little too large. That's why I know what I do when I have something going on in my life. I look at the most extreme option that is opposite of my current life. But you don't have to go extreme, man. If your house is too big, that doesn't mean you have to move into a tiny house. But certainly, Derek, yes, if moving into a smaller house is going to help you, do that. But don't put a constraint on yourself that is going to disrupt not just your life, but the people whose life you are in control over, your daughters mainly. You don't want to disrupt her life either. So constraints are great until they start to disrupt your life.
Yeah, that's great. And or disrupt your life. Disruption can be good, right?
Sure.
But if they disrupt your life so much that it causes pain or suffering, that's when it's a problem. Because maybe what Derek needs here is a bit of a disruption. Because he's living this life. And by the way, thank you for doing what you do. I know we always say that to like people in the military and stuff, which is great. But he is an appliance repair person. And we definitely need people like that because it keeps us from like, I'm going to go out to wherever and buy the new washer and dryer because this one little $40 piece broke on this thing and I don't want to pay for an hour worth of service. No. There are people like you that prevent us from consuming unnecessarily. So you're actually doing some good in the world while you're waiting to live your most ideal life. But this can also be part of your life. The last thing that actually maybe two things here. We'll see. But the last things that I want to talk about here is, in the meantime, let's say you want to just enjoy your city or where you're at, or maybe it's just long weekends, or if you have split custody, it's week on, week off. Maybe you work that out, and so you can go explore for a week, and then you come back and you live this, and maybe you're like, well, but I still have to work 40 hours a week. Okay, maybe you have to work 80 hours this week, so you can have next week off and go explore the world, the country, go to Indianapolis even, explore your own town, and take advantage of the current constraints you have, because exploring the Midwest might be the option for you at the time, but man, the Midwest is pretty awesome. I know, because we spent the first 31 years of our lives there, and you can explore within your current constraints. Last example there was Leo Babalta. I meant to mention him as well. He's from Guam. His family's from Guam. He and his wife have 6 kids, 2 of which are from their marriage, 2 of which are from his from his wife's previous marriage, 2 of which are from his previous marriage. They have 6 kids together, but it's like a whole Brady Bunch, right? Now, in order for him to move to San Francisco, and he's written about this in the past, you all know Leo from our documentary Minimalism, but also from his website zenhabits.net. I encourage you to check that out. He's a great writer. But he has 6 kids. In order for them to all move to San Francisco, he had to find a way to convince not just his wife and their kids to move and make that appealing to them, but make it appealing to former spouses so they would also move from Guam to San Francisco. Man, talk about not possible. I could never do it. I can't come up with anything. He made it happen. If Leo can do that with 6 kids and former spouses and make it work, then so can you, Derek. And I feel really good about that.
What about, Derek, too? What about homeschooling? Because I know that my sister, she started homeschooling my dad's kid. He had one more after him and my mom split up. So they were able to travel. She was able to put time into a couple other programs she wanted to because she was homeschooled. She started being homeschooled about, I think, 7th grade, maybe 8th grade. I don't know how viable that is, Derek. Just helping you brainstorm here.
Well, and Leo actually does that with some of his kids. So he gives them the choice of public school versus, they call it unschooling, which is a version of homeschooling, basically. And actually, he's written about it. Sean, let's put a link to his unschooling essay that he wrote about how he's parenting his kids. I think that will be helpful for Derek. So we'll put that in the show notes for you as well. Derek, last thing I'd love to send you is a copy of our book, Everything That Remains. It's a story of prioritization in a way, because we had these supposedly ideal lives.
In a world with priorities gone wild.
Our next documentary, Priorities Gone Wild. Joshua and Ryan visit South Beach.
Sorry.
It just then it flashes to like an image of you in a thong bikini,
of course,
walking down South Beach. Anyway, it is a story of prioritization, because Ryan and I had these perfect lives, ostensibly perfect from the outside, but it certainly was not ideal, and that's because our priorities were out of whack. And really, what we're talking to you about today, Derek, is What are your priorities? And then how can we really make sure that we want those priorities enough? How can we get enough leverage? And Everything That Remains is a story of that 5-year journey of letting go of our current lives, of the life of excess and consumerism and status and supposed success, and walking toward a more fulfilling life, a life that was filled with good habits and routines and meaningful relationships and creativity, and also involved moving and touring and seeing the country and traveling more than we ever had, but also being grounded in in the people that we wanted to be. And so I think you'll find a lot of value in Everything That Remains, Derek. We'll put a link to that in the show notes, but if you could send him an audiobook version of that, or a book or ebook if that's what he wants, and we'll send those off to you. All right, if you're listening to this, and then, of course, we'd love to hear what you have to say. So if you have a comment or a tip about constraints or restraints, Bex and I are always looking for good sex toy advice. Or if you have any advice for any of our callers today, then leave us a voicemail, 406-219-7839. You can also email a voice memo to podcast@theminimalists.com. We'll air our favorite comments and tips at the end of a future episode, including the end of this episode as well. You can stay tuned for comments and tips from our listeners as well. Ryan, what time is it?
You know what time it is, Josh. It is time for our lightning round, where we answer questions from social media.
We are on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at The Minimalists. During the lightning round, Ryan and I each do our best to answer every question with just a short, shareable, less than 140 character response. We also put the text to these minimal maxims in the show notes, so you can copy and share our pithy answers on social media if you'd like. And now you can find all of our quotes in one place, minimalmaxims.com. Thank you to Jess for curating our 1,000+ quotes over there at minimalmaxims.com.
All right, our first question is from Kiara. What constraints have you implemented in your life to help your life as a minimalist?
Well, so I liked this question because it was a very broad question, so it allowed me to give a broad, tweetable answer here.
I know, it's funny. I love the broad questions for that reason too, man.
Because
you can give broad answers.
Yes, exactly. Or you can get really detailed if you want to too. So you have a plethora of options here, right? So her question really allowed me to define minimalism in a way. And I've been struggling with this for 3 or 4 years now, ever since meeting Ella, who will be turning 5 this month.
God help us all.
Because she'll say, "What is minimalism?" And I'm trying to explaining minimalism to a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, especially when she was 2, trying to explain it to her was difficult. But it's helped me sort of work out my material in front of how do I explain this in a way that everyone can understand it. And I think this is one way. Maybe a 4-year-old isn't going to understand it, but I think this is another way to think about minimalism. So my short answer is this, Kiara. Minimalism is a life of well-curated constraints. So some constraints are good. Too many constraints might be bad. But if we curate our constraints, we choose our constraints carefully, well, then we're going to live a well-lived life.
Absolutely, man. Kiara, here's what I'd say. Every impulse is a potential pothole on the road to a meaningful life. So, what constraints do I have? They really are geared towards my impulses. If I didn't have constraints on TV, I'd sit there and drool on myself, and I would just sit there and watch reruns of The Office and Seinfeld and Friends and all the other shows that I love to drool to.
There's a lot of drooling.
Yeah, hey, you're a fan of drooling too, man.
I drool a lot, but mine's unintentional.
Mine's intentional.
Yeah.
I guess in a way it is intentional.
Intentionaldrooling.com. It's Ryan's new blog.
But it's funny. It just to think about. So we're talking about how constraints can help people live a meaningful life, but there are constraints we could put on ourselves that will prevent us from living a meaningful life. And I think giving into every impulse we have, that is the biggest constraint that we could have when it comes to living a meaningful life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so what you're saying is that if we act on impulse, we're acting like a child. I mean, we're going to run out in traffic, we're going to drive grandma's Suburban around the neighborhood and crash into cars. And because what was the other thing that kid said in that video? He said, it's fun to do bad things. Yeah, guess what? It's fun to do bad things. And that's ultimately what you're saying. Yeah, it's fun to do bad things, but bad things don't ever lead to a meaningful life. It's the opposite. It's a life of impulse. It's not a meaningful life.
All right, our next question is from Joshua Hook.
He's been on fire with these questions.
I was going to say, man,
I think this is his
second,
third. It's his
second
third,
or third,
I think.
yeah. All right, Joshua Hook. How can we determine what constraints are in our best interests? I know for me, I have a tendency to dislike constraints and chafe against them, even if they are in my best interests.
So my short answer to that is constraints are useful only when they increase our freedom.
Yeah, we were just talking about how too many constraints can absolutely prevent us from living a meaningful life.
Right.
We don't want to just deprive ourselves of TV or deprive ourselves of whatever it may be that's interfering with our life just for the sake of deprivation.
Right. Unless you're just doing it as a short-term experiment.
Sure.
So I'll talk real quick, Joshua Hook, about some of the things I've let go of. Sometimes I will put up a temporary time period. So a few of the things that, the sort of magic tricks that I've done as a minimalist or becoming a minimalist, I got rid of TV for 9 years. And then we moved into this new apartment in Los Angeles, and the previous tenant left this giant TV on the wall. And now I feel like, okay, I've over the last 9 years shaped a habit around that constraint, so I can bring it back into my life more intentionally. In fact, we watched Westworld on it last night, which was a great TV show. But we do appointment viewing now. We don't just sit down and binge watch stuff. Now, I got rid of my cell phone for 2 months, and when I brought it back into my life, finally, I realized like that constraint was deprivation, and I realized like when I bring it back in, I can use it differently. I don't have to have Twitter and Instagram and email on my phone, but I can use it to make phone calls, or send text messages, or GPS, or listen to podcasts, or listen to music, or however I want to use the phone, but use it in a more intentional way. So sometimes those constraints help us, temporary constraints help us identify how to use our things, our tools, in a more intentional way. Also, a few other things I did. I got rid of home internet for 5 years, and that made me more productive, but also reshaped my habits in a way that I didn't expect. And we've written about all these things on the website, so Sean, if you can put a link to at least those 3 things I just talked about there. Last thing I got rid of, another constraint I put in my life, I got rid of goals. And I did that for 100 days. And in fact, I didn't even do it for 100 days at first. Our friend Leo Babalta, he wrote about it, and so I said, I'm going to give up goals for 100 days because, but I'm going to give up goals, I don't know for how long, because I don't want it to be a goal. And that constraint helped me realize that the work we put in, our standards are much greater than our expectations. Our standards get us farther than our expectations do. And so those are a few constraints. Maybe living without goals for a period of time is a type of constraint that will better serve your creativity or what you want to accomplish.
It makes me think about this gentleman. I was doing a podcast interview at this festival back in February, right before we took off for Australia. But after the podcast interview, this gentleman came up to me, and he was like, dude, I really am a fan of your, documentary and I love the podcast and stuff. He's like, I just need some advice on, as a musician, like, what do I do how do I use minimalism to help me be a better musician? And I was like, well, what do you see as your problem right now? He's like, well, I know how to play guitar. I know how to play this instrument, that instrument, the bongos, da-da-da. I'm like, which one are you an expert at? Oh, I'm not an expert at any of them. I just know how to play all of them. I'm like, okay. I was like, do you like to sing? He's like, oh yeah, man, I love to sing. I was like, okay, why don't you see what you can do with your voice? Just use your voice. And then he's like, oh yeah. And I'm like, and if there's another instrument you need to bring in, then bring in that instrument.
Yeah, like slowly introducing things.
Yeah.
It reminded me of this metaphor, it just popped in my head. Diving deep on one thing. We know there are people who are deep sea divers. I've never heard of a wide sea diver.
That's really good, man. Yeah, it's absolutely true, man. I was really encouraged to hear him say like, yeah, man, you know what? I'm going to stop playing all my instruments for a month and just use my voice. And he was like, if I feel like I need to bring in another instrument after this month, I'll do that.
Yeah.
He's like, but if I'm, get some really good stuff going with my voice and I feel good about that, then I'm just going to continue using my voice. But just a perfect example of how, you throw a little constraint on there and you start to think of your situation a little bit differently.
That's definitely a helpful constraint.
My answer to you is this, Joshua Hook: continuously avoiding things we dislike stunts our growth.
Yes, yeah.
So he's talking about how he has a tendency to dislike constraints, and he avoids them. Essentially, is what he's saying. If you avoid everything that you dislike, you're probably gonna live a pretty banal life.
Yeah.
And you're gonna feel probably like you're not living the most meaningful life possible.
Yeah, if you nerf your world, you're never going to develop the calluses necessary to create something meaningful. Damn, that was pithy, Sean. You better write that one down. All right, and we have one more question here. This question is from Savani. Savani asks, how can there be an upside to constraint? All I say is give me loads of money so I can find out if it truly doesn't work. Now, what Savani is alluding to here is in our documentary, Jim Carrey has a quote in there. It says, everyone knows money doesn't buy happiness, but everyone wants to try it out for themselves just to find out, right? And okay, we have a really good answer. At least I think I have a good answer for this. We'll expand on it a lot. But if you want to hear my answer and Ryan's answer to that question, you can listen to this week's postscript episode over at the Minimalists private podcast, which is exclusive to our Patreon supporters. That's why it's private. So if you want to support our show, and if you want to help keep this podcast 100% advertisement free, then head on over to theminimalists.com/support. Also, in addition to our weekly postscript episodes, which we put up every Wednesday, the Minimalist private podcast feed includes our monthly Ask the Minimalists Anything episode. So we interact with our Patreon supporters and they can ask us literally anything they want. Also, unreleased recordings of all of our live events. In fact, we're putting up Sydney this month, and I think, Ryan, your favorite event of the whole tour last year was probably Melbourne.
Yeah, Melbourne.
The first Melbourne.
The first Melbourne was my favorite, only because the one gal in there was just hilarious.
Yeah,
I mean, she was just like,
and our answer was
so good.
Oh my gosh. In fact, there would be a really funny title for that episode that I can't say right now, but how about we do Melbourne exclusively for our Patreon supporters next month?
Okay.
Because each month we're putting out these live events just for our Patreon supporters. I know that was your favorite. We already put out my favorite live episode. Mine was from Edmonton last year, which is on our main feed.
Oh, I thought you were talking about from the Australian leg. That first Melbourne stop was definitely my favorite. What was your favorite Australian stop?
My favorite Australian stop was probably Sydney. Yeah, cool. So which we put out this one. So if you want recordings of all of our live events, that also goes up in the Minimalist private podcast feed. And once you become a supporter, you also receive a personal link to that podcast feed. So it shows up right there in your podcast player, whatever you're listening to this podcast on right now. So you don't have to get on the internet and log into some website every single time you want to listen to this. It shows up right there on your phone regularly, just if you're a supporter of the show. And also as a Patreon supporter, you also receive access to our monthly live stream videos, as well as first access to tickets to all of our live events before those tickets are available to the public, and the entire back catalog of all of our past private podcast episodes. You can find all the details and good stuff over at theminimalists.com/support. And if you want a little snippet, here's a snippet from this week's postscript episode. I am all for money. Money helps us as a resource. Just like time is a resource, attention is a resource, relationships can be a resource in our life. The assets, physical goods are all resources. The question is, how do we use those resources? And if we are irresponsible with the few resources we have don't have a lot of money, and we're irresponsible with that little bit of money, what are we going to do when we get a lot of money? It's going to amplify our irresponsibility. Mm-hmm. We're going to be less responsible with more money. And how do I know this? Because all of my 20s, that's exactly what I did. I grew up really poor, realized that, we're not happy because we don't have any money. So let's go make some money. I went out and got the entry-level corporate sales job, started making good money and then better money and then better money, but I always spent more money than I made. I was irresponsible. And it turns out the reason I was discontented growing up is my family made bad decisions with the few resources we had. And then I continued to amplify those bad decisions with more money. However, now that we are in our 30s and moving toward 40, money has become a resource with which we can do good. All right, and we're back. And if you want to hear that full conversation, you can become a patron over at theminimalists.com. Okay, now it's time for our added value portion of the show. This is where we each talk about something that has added value to our lives recently. Ryan, what's added value to your life recently?
Oh, dude, I got one of those new albums that are old to recommend to you.
One of those old new albums.
Yeah.
Or is it the new old?
The new old album? I think it's old new album.
Okay.
Because it's new to me.
Uh-huh.
No, there's a band called Milky Chance. A group. You said it might be one guy. I don't really know if it's one or two guys.
I think it's one or two guys. I accidentally went to one of their concerts.
Mm-hmm.
I was at South by Southwest in 2015.
Did you like it?
I loved the show, and I know the hit song they have. I forget the title of it. That first big hit that they had, and the live show was solid, man.
Nice. No, they have I think it's from last year. They have an album called Blossom. People are probably listening to me right now like, duh. Yeah, that's an awesome album. But if you haven't heard of this album, I just found it, again, like just from listening to, like picking a radio station or a playlist, and then a song comes on, and I'm like, oh, who's this band? And then I look them up, and like they've been around forever.
Right.
And, yeah.
Have you guys heard the Rolling Stones?
Oh my God, so many awesome hits.
Well, I have 3 things that have added value to my life, but they all sort of pertain to this idea of constraints. One is a constraint I've added to onto myself that has improved my sleep significantly over the last few months. And I know because sometimes I slip up and I don't put this constraint on myself, and it hurts my sleep. So I do no liquids after 5 p.m. I don't drink any liquids after 5 p.m. Some days I try to push it as close to 3 p.m. as possible. Now, I fully hydrate. That's why I just had to take a bathroom break. Podcast Sean's such a good editor. You don't even know that I just took a bathroom break a moment ago. In fact, I'm peeing my pants right now.
Hot?
No.
Oh.
Anyway, so I stopped drinking liquids after 5 p.m. and that way I don't have to get up in the middle of the night and use the bathroom, right? And for me, for whatever I saw a tweet the other day. It said, I just turned 40 and now congratulations, my bladder is now the size of a shot glass. Yeah, and since I'm steamrolling towards 40, for whatever reason, I feel like I always have to get up in the middle of the night and pee, and so now I don't if I don't drink any liquid. So that's a constraint that improves my life. But throughout the day, I'm constantly drinking a ton of water up until then, so I make sure I'm not dehydrated. I drink a lot of water, and it forces me to just have a window of constraint where I'm staying fully hydrated. So that's one constraint that has certainly added value to my life. It's helped me sleep better. One other recommendation or just thing that has added value to my life, Matt Carney's new album just came out.
Yeah.
And the reason that it's called Crazy Talk. Mm-hmm. And the reason that
it's been out, kind of.
Sort of.
Half of it's been out.
Yeah, he was putting out one song at a time for a while. Like he put out 5 or 6 singles before the album came out, and I think it's 13 tracks now. He has a beautiful cover of Sade. My mom used to always listen to Sade when we were growing up, and he does a great cover of one of Sade's songs. But the whole album's great, but the reason Constraints came to mind with this album, Crazy Talk, is this is his first independent release. So he left his major record label. He built a studio in his own house. He doesn't have the big budget. In fact, I read...
It's like one of his best albums ever, man.
Absolutely, and that's the point. So I read this article. He said, for my first album, Nothing Left to Lose, he said...
That was independent, right?
No.
Oh, okay.
The record company spent $250,000 just on the video.
Oh, wow.
The first video to the first single was $250,000. He said, I don't spend that much on recording and marketing the entire album now. You know, record companies used to spend millions of dollars to make albums like this, but now he has his own tiny recording studio at his house, and he's independent, and he's made this album with those constraints, has actually made the album better. And he's evolved too. The thing I love about Matt Carney's music is it's always emphatically Matt Carney, but it always reflects a time period within his life. He's somehow simultaneously and paradoxically stays true to his sound while his sound evolves. It sounds like that's impossible, but he does it. It's like he doesn't take such a far leap that like where Dylan went electronic or whatever, but he progresses enough that it's far away from his previous album, that each album is its own body of work, has its own sound. And I think the constraints on this album in particular made the album more contemporary, but also forced him to get more creative with the fewer resources that he had.
That totally reminds me about, I think I recommended Frank Turner not too long ago. His full album just came out either today or yesterday. I was so happy. Because like the new way that they're releasing records, man, it's just, or albums, it drives me crazy.
Right, yeah. Well, I mean, it's very singles driven, which people think is new, but it's actually, that's a 60s and 70s and 50s thing, right? People just, it was all, 7-inch singles, and now we're just, in a weird way, gone back to the 7-inch, except it's a 4-inch phone upon which we listen to these endless singles, right? And because also there's a lot of, talk about a constraint, fewer resources go into making a single, and you can make 100 singles, and if one of them hits, all of a sudden you're touring for 2 years off of that one single.
It's unbelievable.
Right? Now, personally, I'm more of an album guy, and I know you're an album guy as well, Ryan. So check out Crazy Talk from Matt Carney. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. And last but not least, since we're talking about constraints, to me, the best constraint there is honesty. So honesty is the best constraint. There's a great book called Lying by Sam Harris. It'll take you an hour to read. In fact, if you listen to it on audiobook, it's an hour and 15-minute audiobook, and that's with a Q&A he does at the end of it. So it's like having a podcast episode, basically. It's one of the most concise and clearly written screeds about why not to lie under any circumstance, unless lying becomes self-defense. But then, of course, it's not lying. If someone's at your door and they're a murderer and are you home? You're not going to say, well, yes, I'm home. Please kill me. But he gives you an example, even around things that are controversial, like Santa Claus, and he presents a great answer as to why not to lie to your kids about Santa Claus, but how you can still present the myth of Santa Claus in a way. That's what we do with Ella. In fact, you've seen this because we went down to Rodeo Drive this year with Ella, and like she sat on Santa's lap. She believes Santa's real, even though I tell her he's not real, and we explain.
Well, she saw him at the mall.
That's what she says to me. I said, but I'm like, but Santa's just made up. It's just a guy in a costume. She goes, no, Josh, I saw him at the mall. And I'm like, yeah, but he's just a man in a costume. I said, if I dressed up like Peppa Pig, would I be Peppa Pig? She's like, well, no. I said, well, that's what some people do. They'll dress up like Santa Claus. She goes, okay, but I saw him at the mall. So no, I mean, I make sure that I've never lied to Ella, and it's one of the things I'm most proud of, because I know that if I want her to be able to trust me, then I can't lie about some things and then expect that she's going to believe me with respect to other things, right? Absolutely. Sometimes telling the truth is difficult, but Sam Harris presents some ways in that book, Lying, and it's in fact, I bought it for a friend who's going through a tough time with some experiences that he's had recently, and it just made me go back and re-listen to the audiobook version, because Bex had never listened to it. When we were driving out to Joshua Tree this weekend, she found a lot of value in it as well. It was the first book of Sam Harris's she had been exposed to, and I think it's a great place to start with his work as well. All right, let's move on to Right Here, Right Now. It's where we talk about what's going on in the lives of the Minimalists. Well, we have a photo of our new podcast studio up on our Instagram page. If you want to check that out, we'll put a link to that in the show notes. We're just at the Minimalists on Instagram. And we have a video tour of the new podcast studio coming soon on Patreon for our Patreon supporters. Since it is you fine folks who have helped us build this new podcast studio and are funding the soon-to-be video version of this podcast. So if you want to subscribe to the video version of this podcast, just head on over to youtube.com/theminimalists. Also, I'm teaching a writing class coming up June 24th. Just twice a year, I do a 2-hour workshop on how to write better. So most of you know I teach a 4-week writing class online, and you can check that out over at howtowritebetter.org. But I know some of you don't have the resources or the time, the money, or the attention to spend 4 weeks on a writing class. So what I try to do is tweeze out some of my favorite ingredients from that 4-week class and make it so you can at least get started on how to write better, how to improve your writing after this 2-hour workshop. It's a standalone, independent workshop, and you can find that over at theminimalists.com/workshop. It's called How to Write Better, 2-hour workshop. And what we'll do is it's a live workshop, but if you can't attend the live version, we'll have the video available afterwards. So you'll have access in perpetuity to the recorded video. But if you are on that workshop, we'll also be doing a Q&A at the end of it so I can answer some of your writing questions. That's June 24th, theminimalists.com/workshop. And if you want to receive any new writings on our website, or if you want to get the show notes that you always hear us talking about at the end of every episode, then we'll send those right to your email inbox. Just go to theminimalists.com, enter your email address at the top. We'll also send you any news about our new documentary that we're working on once we have more details about that. Also, any new tour stops that we announce in the future or events that we have with the Minimalists Live, then you will be one of the first people to know over at theminimalists.com. Enter your email address there. We'll never send you any spam or anything you don't want, though, because that stuff's gross. Ryan, you got anything else for us?
Finally, here are some voicemail comments and tips from our listeners.
Hi, my name is Nina from Little Rock, Arkansas, and this is regarding your school's episode. I really enjoyed listening to this episode. As a parent of 2 soon-to-be school-age kids, I have found myself researching educational options and came across homeschooling and how statistically homeschooled kids learn better because there are less stressors that are associated with what we know as traditional education. There is more flexibility with pursuing personal interests, as well as the ability to learn at the child's pace rather than preparing for exams. Since I am an active duty military member, I have had the option to pass my GI Bill to my kids. So they have secured funds to attend college if they choose to do so. But if they don't attend, I have come to the realization that I am okay with that. As long as I am able to cultivate a lifelong desire to learn, I feel I would have met my intent. My mindset on college has shifted as well. Considering that emotional intelligence is far more valuable than a degree, like you said in the podcast, how many people have degrees and how many attend college for the social reasons? Life itself is a classroom. With such an emphasis on academics, a lot of soft skills are not developed. And I have found through homeschooling options, there is a development of the whole child, not just academically. So those soft skills are developed exponentially because they are learning via real life interactions, not a classroom environment. As my husband and I approach retirement from the military, we have agreed to prepare for a less hectic and less stressful life, and to homeschool and possibly world school and learn from the very real world that we have around us.
Hi, I recently had a little accidental discovery about decluttering and kids and toys, and I know you guys get asked about that all the time, so I thought it might be helpful if I shared my experience. As a rule of thumb, I really haven't done much or don't do much with my kids with minimalism. I try to, show them, model for them, and talk to them about, why I have less stuff or the decisions we make about things in our house, but I haven't decluttered them in any real way. I've sort of resigned myself to living with kid clutter. However, about a month ago, we had some work done on the house and we got dust everywhere, including all over their toys. So I took all their toys to the basement with the intention of cleaning them off and bringing them back up. I didn't have a ton of time right then, so I initially just cleaned off a couple of their favorites. I brought them back and just told the kids that, their toys were coming and that if they needed any toys in the meantime, if there's anything particularly they wanted, they could ask me for it and I would go clean it off and bring it to them. That was about a month ago, and I have occasionally been asked for a toy here or there, but for the most part, 80% of their toys have been in the basement, and they're not bored and they're not complaining, and there's a lot less clutter in the house, and they might have even learned something. So I had an accidental packing party with my kids' toys, and it worked.
Hi, my name's Eloise. I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I wanted to thank you very much for touching on food and its association with minimalism. I've struggled for many, many, many years with an eating disorder and have been recovering now for about 2 years. And this is about the same amount of time that I've been investing my energy into minimalism. So today when I was listening to your podcast, I realised just how big of an impact minimalism has had on my ability to recover from bulimia. I sat down after listening to the podcast and I made a really long list about how it has positively impacted my recovery. And it's long, but the most prominent thing I can think of is being more aware of the wasted time, the wasted energy, the wasted food, the wasted thought processes. I've wasted so much of my life on my eating disorder. Your podcast has helped me purge the things from my life that led me to feel overwhelmed and out of control, and those were the things that led me to my eating disorder.
All right, y'all, that's it for this episode. If you have a question for the Minimalists, give us a call, 406-219-7839. You can also email a voice memo to podcast@theminimalists.com. And if you leave here with just one message, we hope it's this: love people and use things, because the opposite never works. Thanks for listening, y'all.
We'll see you next time.
The Minimalists.